Good morning, and thank you for joining us for Eye on New Mexico today. This past week, New Mexico Voices for Children released its annual Kids Count data book just ahead of this year's legislative session, which started this past week. And joining me to talk about that this morning, Dr. Veronica Garcia, the Executive Director of New Mexico Voices for Children. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, of course, you guys always do this data book timed with the legislative session. We last spoke to you on this program last year in June when the Annie E. Casey Foundation put out its annual Kids Count ranking of the states.
Correct.
And people know this one because this is the one where, unfortunately, New Mexico consistently ranks near the bottom. We were 49th in 2014, so one spot above last place in the nation. But your goal with the data book is to really look at how New Mexico compares to ourselves, how we look county to county, if we're improving, trends here. Is that right?
That's correct, and I'm going to show the book. It's available on our website, and what we do annually is produce the Kids Count data book. This data book is used by policymakers, it's used by grant writers, it's used by school districts, healthcare professionals, etc., to track various statistics in New Mexico by county and, when appropriate, by school district. But what we wanted to do is, all of these rankings are relative, right? And the year that we dropped to 50th, which was 2013, I believe, the main reason was that Mississippi had added more pre-K programs. And so the relative standing isn't always as meaningful. And so what we wanted to do is to see, how is New Mexico doing over time? It's important to know how we rank nationally, but is a trend analysis. Are we getting better? And so we have 2 data points now. We can see a tiny little trend. Every year we'll be able to track this better so that policymakers and other civic leaders can look at this data book and track child well-being for New Mexico by county and district.
Give us a rundown of the areas that you guys look at and that go into this report.
Right.
And we'll go into more of them specifically.
Sure. Yeah. And this follows very closely the Annie E. Casey domains. So it looks at economic well-being, it looks at education, it looks at health, and it looks at family and community. So, for example, within a domain, let's say education, it will look at graduation rates, or it'll look at adults who have a high school diploma. For example, it's unfortunate that 15% of adults 18 to 64 don't have a high school diploma.
Wow.
So that has implications in terms of having an educated workforce, right? And the kinds of companies that we can attract to our state. For example, in health, we look at low birth weight, and you know, how are we tracking in that, or infant mortality, teen suicide, that sort of thing.
Yeah, all of those things that matter for children and then adults later on as well. Poverty is always a key issue in this book, and I was concerned, very disturbed to read the report that came out nationally this past week about more than half of students nationwide receiving free and reduced lunch, basically indicating that they all are living in low income or below the poverty level families. New Mexico, of course, is one of the worst among those among all states, and so it's just it indicates that all over the country this is becoming the norm, it seems like.
It's really sad, and I think the income inequality is increasing, and I think we're losing our middle class, which is, you know, being able to work and to be able to live, have a living wage. And we have many families that are working, are employed, and are still at the poverty level. And there is a sort of a myth that's repeated that people working in minimum wage jobs are typically teenagers or entry-level jobs. We don't need to worry about it. When in fact the majority are single moms between the ages of 23 and 28, trying to raise a family and having a very difficult time. And so I'm glad to see that there's bipartisan support for a minimum wage increase. We hope that it will be not a small little token increase that wouldn't make a whole lot of difference, but one that can help families be able to support themselves. The other thing is that typically when you're on minimum wage, you're not going to be squirreling away the money, saving it for a rainy day. You're going to be using it to buy goods and services to survive, right? Right now.
Yeah.
So it flows back into the economy. They'll be spending it in the local economy. They'll be paying gross receipts tax. So all in all, it's good for everyone.
New Mexico, will remind people, it has a $7.50 an hour minimum wage right now, and state lawmakers, as you mentioned, there does seem to be bipartisan support for increasing that during this legislative session. Of course, some of the municipalities around the state have a higher wage, but yeah, I can't imagine living on that. And it seems like here in New Mexico, there is an understanding from both parties that we do live in a poor state where a lot of families are struggling. So there was really no one who wanted to support bringing the grocery tax back, things like that came up, that were talked about this year. Do you think that there is bipartisan recognition of these issues that our state is facing, and are they doing enough in Santa Fe?
I think there is recognition. I think that last year there was an attempt to have a minimum wage, statewide, and also index for inflation. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. I think we've heard both parties say it's going to require compromise, but I think we need to think of the quality of life of all New Mexicans, and that, and also the jobs that are available, so that families, the working poor, can have a better chance for a better quality of life and do better for their children. However, coupled with that, I don't know if you've ever heard of the concept, or if your viewers have heard of the notion of what they call a cliff effect. And that is that you may qualify for child care assistance, and then you get a small little raise, and all of a sudden you don't qualify anymore, but you can't afford quality child care. And child care can cost as much as college tuition. And I'm sure you're thinking about your kids and you're saving for college, but no one really prepares you. You're not really able to save for quality child care. And so we're recommending and proposing that the child care assistance go to 200% of the federal poverty level to incentivize people to work, to support them to work, but more importantly for the children, that they are in quality child care settings where we're not talking about lining up the kids in little desks or anything, but that they, learning can be part of play, play can be part of learning, building vocabulary, pre-literacy, and the soft skills, taking turns, all of the different kinds of things that are important to be successful in school.
Yeah, I will take this opportunity to say I'm so grateful for the child care providers in my life, the ones who take care of my kids. They're so great, and I doubt they're paid well enough for it, but they make such a difference in so many lives. So they're doing a terrific job.
And you can do a good job because you're not worried about your children, that they are being well cared for. What this book, and if people hopefully will download it, it's available on our website, has really focused on, and various nonprofits like the Kellogg Foundation, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, who do a lot of research on child well-being, highly recommend a two-generation approach to child well-being. That is that we need to work with the children don't live in a vacuum.
Right.
They live in a family context. So how do we support the family holistically to be able to ensure that child well-being is strong? But we have to think futuristically. If children have a good early start and they do well in school, they're going to graduate from high school, they're going to be ready for college and career, and we can break this cycle of poverty. I think it's like in the top 10 reasons of what businesses look at relocating, more so than tax incentives, is an educated workforce and a high quality of life where there's the arts and crime is low. And how do you get that? By having people that are employed and doing well. Economist James Heckman, I think I've talked to you about him before, he's a Nobel Prize winner, says that the greatest investment, return on investment that we can get is investing in the early years. Home visitation, early quality child care, and pre-K. And so that is our focus this legislative session, is to get more funding for these early learning programs. And it's key. and I could talk a little bit more about that if you'd like.
Let's talk a little bit about pre-K too, especially working into that and the legislative goals that you guys have, because I know pre-K's been a big focus of New Mexico Voices for a long time.
Yes, it has been. And we still have roughly 30,000 children who are eligible for pre-K who are not receiving those services. And I think we have to look at why. I know there's been money left on the table sometimes, so we need to delve deeply into what are the reasons that private providers aren't applying for those funds, or why are school districts not applying for the funds, because the demand is there and the children need it. Home visitation is so important. And if you look at by county, we could look at the more high-risk counties, that need that support in terms of funding to get these programs in place. But if you look at child abuse, we want a more preventative, proactive than coming in after the fact when a child has already been harmed. And many times it's because parents don't understand normal child development. They don't understand why the baby won't stop crying. Or we can also help parents help their children get ready to be good learners, and to the brain development. 80% of brain development happens between 0 to 5, and in those first 18 months, 2 years, the baby. Some people think, well, the baby's not picking up a whole lot, but they're picking up everything, and they're also picking up toxic stress. And so if there is domestic violence, or if there is alcohol abuse, or the mother is suffering from postpartum depression, that home visitation can help.
A bill that's come up already in the legislative session that's very interesting is a push to require early intervention parental services for families where there is neglect or abuse. That seems like a great idea and right in line with what you guys are talking about in terms of if a family is struggling with abuse or stress, even stuff like that, to get them anger management classes, parenting classes, alcohol and drug counseling. But how, but without having a serious incident that brings CYFD into the home, that does seem like it would be difficult maybe to identify all of these families.
I also feel that, I think it's well intended, very well intended, but it's reactive, it's after the fact. And I think that our dollars would be best used in proactive, before it happens, providing support right after the baby is born. And so you want to start, maybe with teen parents that don't have any skills or support, and continue up the line. Target counties that have more substantiated high child abuse. And let's be proactive in giving the families the support that they need. I don't think it's a bad idea to provide that sort of intervention and training, but if we're going to invest dollars, let's put them on the front end before a child has already been harmed by having been abused or in an abusive environment.
We're going to continue talking with Dr. Veronica Garcia from New Mexico Voices for Children when we come back. Stay with us for a minute. Welcome back. Thank you for staying with us this morning. Once again, we're talking about child welfare in New Mexico, child well-being, with Dr. Veronica Garcia, the Executive Director of New Mexico Voices for Children, out with the 2014 Kids Count Data Book this past week, part of the kickoff to the legislative session. You guys do this every year, and as we mentioned, if you missed it off the top of the program, this is the report that is tied in with that national ranking that comes out every year by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, where New Mexico, sadly, has hovered near the bottom and has been at the bottom in the past. 49th in the nation last year was our ranking. But the goal with this book is to break down what's happening here in New Mexico, and if we're improving here compared to ourselves, as opposed to just compared to the nationwide rankings here.
You nailed that.
And that's exactly right. And it's so important because someone is going to be last on the rankings.
Exactly.
Always. But we need to know if we're improving here, year to year.
Exactly.
So you guys have some policy initiatives that you want to push here in the legislative session and throughout the year. Tell us a little bit about some of those.
All right. So we've been talking a lot about poverty and what can we do to try to impact that. And, I started to talk about that earlier, of a two-generation approach, which means working with the whole, with the parents or the guardians of the children and the children together. So if, say, a parent has dropped out of high school and doesn't have good employment. How can we then provide training to that parent? Is it a language barrier? Can we do ESL? Is it adult basic education that that parent needs in order to be successful? Providing child care assistance so the parent can have that. We also, raising the minimum wage, we talked about that earlier. We think that that is going to be important. Something that folks don't realize is that there's something as the refundable tax credits that families are entitled to, and those tax credits must be protected because they are the little bit of money that a family gets sometimes to buy glasses or new tires or dental costs that they do annually. We've heard of many families that rely on those. Those need to be protected. Protecting SNAP benefits and not putting unrealistic requirements. SNAP is the the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. We haven't even talked about hunger and food insecurity, and that is a real problem for so many children where the main nutrition they're getting is at school. In some ways, we mentioned off the top of the show that more than half of students nationwide now, and well beyond that in New Mexico, are receiving free and reduced lunches at school, and qualifying for that, which means they are living in low-income families or below the poverty level. But, one bright side is that they are getting a meal at school, and we're doing more breakfasts at school here, too, as well. Yes, we started that, several years ago, phasing that in lower income communities. And I'm glad to see that it is expanding. And I think that if we want children to be able to do well in school, you need sound nutrition. And I think that on the surface, it sounds great. Well, if the parents are going to get, food stamps, for lack of a better term, then they need to be working. Well, if the jobs aren't available, who really suffers? I mean, the whole family suffers. And if a child, to me it's unconscionable to have a child not have food. Supposedly, we're a society that cares about our children, and we're going to let children not have food. It is, to me, unconscionable. And so, the supplemental assistance is that. It's supplemental. You couldn't live on that. So it's critical support that children need to be successful. So we want to protect those benefits. And we also need to enact tougher predatory lending laws. Many of these predatory lenders prey on people who are low income, who are desperate, but then ties them in this never-ending cycle of debt. We had a presentation by the Attorney General's office, who have done a lot of investigation and research on predatory lending, and many of these lenders are set up knowing full well that these people will never be able to pay, and they get caught up in very, very high interest and just exacerbates a problem. And then economic development incentives for creating jobs and more accountability for jobs. We've given corporate tax cuts with the intent that they're going to create jobs, but there's been no accountability that they've actually created them. A good way for us to track that is through a tax expenditure budget, so we will be focusing on that. And
what kind of incentives are being given? Yeah.
Sure.
Education is another key element, another area where you'll be pushing different policies. Tell us about what you guys are doing, and then how that correlates with or maybe doesn't with what the governor wants to do, because she, in her State of the State address this past week, obviously education, the children are always going to be a big focus of whatever any politician says, but she's still pushing for her push to end social promotion in schools and make sure kids here can read. That one has really struggled to get through, and yet I don't know how anyone could say they don't want kids to be able to read as they go through school.
I think, when we create that either or, it's sort of a false argument. Everyone wants children to read by 3rd grade. What I think people need to understand is that in statute now, schools can hold back kids at any grade. That's in place. And parents can refuse only one time. So that ability is already in statute. The the idea of third grade retention on the surface makes a lot of sense. What we think is more important is focusing on supporting children early on, that they are getting the pre-literacy through quality childcare and pre-K, that we're extending the school day for children that are falling behind, early warning systems in place so that we know developmentally if a child in pre-K, in kindergarten is struggling. That's where programs like K3+ make a difference, adding that additional 20 days, and to do something different for that child. I think the reason that people are struggling with just automatic mandatory retention is based on one test. You never make that kind of a decision that is so critical without one test. How close is that child to proficiency? Is it just going to be this, random?
So a little too black and
white. But what the research really show is that it actually has a negative effect, that they're more likely to drop out of high school, and that it really does not improve literacy to any great degree. And so you have to really look at what are the preventions, what can be happening before the end of third grade to ensure that all is being done and ensure that every effort is made towards literacy. I think everyone wants children to read by third grade, but I think it's because of what the research shows of the negative impacts of retention outweigh the positives of holding a child back.
You mentioned testing, and of course that's something that a lot of teachers will say is not helping them do their jobs any better. They mandated testing from the federal level. What can we even do in New Mexico with regards to that?
I think that there'll be a push to look at mandated testing and what is required. I think because testing has become so high stakes that many school districts impose then what's called short cycle assessment to gauge where children are, to then modify instruction to where the balance has been tipped and more time is put into test prep and prepping for the test and so on. I think if we focus on quality education, focus on the standards, that there may be less need for it. I think that much of the testing that is in place, some of it may be self-imposed and not necessarily required testing. So I think, that's a local decision that every school district needs to take a close look at what is truly required. And I think that the federal government is recognizing that as well.
I'll point out, we were talking about this book, how it breaks down county by county, district by district statistics for a variety of these factors. One of them is graduation rates, and you do see quite a variety. So when you guys put this together and say you want to make certain changes at the state level, this impacts different areas differently because not everyone is struggling with their graduation rates the same way. Talk about that a little.
Well, I think we also need to look at where all the students are concentrated. And so here's an interesting statistic that 2/3 of the students are in 1/3 of the districts. 200 of, and then we have almost a quarter of our districts that have less than 200 kids. So you have to look at where is the concentration of the kids,
those numbers,
and looking at the graduation rates. And also the counties, you'll see some correlation with income. But you'll also see school districts like Rio Rancho, we mentioned, during the break, that were, doing
84%, I believe, graduation rate.
And Rio Rancho is a school district that has had considerable stability. They've had one superintendent. They use a lot of quality tools. They've been doing that for quite some time in terms of making data-driven decisions and make adjustments for that. So I think the strong leadership and a very systemic approach to how they look at data and making adjustments in their programs has really been, I think there's a lot to learn from that school district. But I think it needs to be analyzed and looked at. Truancy, I know that there's a big truancy summit that took place, and when kids are not in school, they can't benefit from the educational program. They're more likely to drop out of school. So getting communities to understand that every day counts, that keeping kids at home to babysit, or if they're not ill, or a family emergency, a death, going on vacation, that's not optional during school time. It's critical. Every single day matters. And then once you start missing school, it becomes a habit.
Yeah.
And it's a habit that is formed in early years. And kindergartners, first graders, second graders, third graders, they don't make a choice if they don't want to go to school. Their parents make that choice. And so by their actions, they're communicating to their children whether school is important or not, and developing those habits early. So we as a society, as a community, really need to address it. I think sometimes, people might say, well, what's none of your business, but I could be out at a restaurant and I'll see some kids. I'll say, oh, hi, aren't you at school today? Was there no school?
Just kind of being funny, but
yeah, but I think we all play a part of that in communicating as a society, just like we do manners, yes, please, thank you. But it's also important that we instill in our society that every day counts in school.
Yeah, absolutely. With just about a minute and a half left, I want to let you point out anything else you guys are working on in Santa Fe this legislative session.
Well, one that we've talked about before is that to do these investments in early learning and education, it is costly. Estimates between 300 and 400 million. We're about a fourth of the way there. Doing a constitutional amendment to allow New Mexicans, and a journal poll showed New Mexicans support a constitutional amendment to take a small portion of the land grant permanent fund for early learning is important. And I think when dollars are scarce, gas and oil revenue is down, that we need to look at bold efforts to address a crisis that we have in our state, and it could help us turn it around.
How we're spending our money. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Veronica Garcia from New Mexico Voices for Children. You can access the Kids Count Data Book on their website.
Yes,
actually.
you can.
Right now. We'll link to that on our website, KOB.com, as well. Thank you for watching this weekend, and we'll be back next week with another topic. We'll see you next Sunday on Eye on New Mexico.